So let's talk about Thomas Pynchon. Hi, I'm Seth Connell. The reason I'm putting together these videos is that I'm finding topics that I think are interesting that need a little bit more conversation. And for some reason, I don't think people talk about these subjects enough, or at least not in the way I think they should be. I watched recently the movie One Battle After Another that is based off of Thomas Pynchon's book, um, Vineland. And after I went and watched that movie, it was so bad I actually walked out of it. I didn't even want to waste my time with it. It was a terrible movie. And I think it was almost a desecration of the types of books that Thomas Pynchon writes. I was very heavily influenced in the last year or so by his book, Gravity's Rainbow. And that's a very classical piece of postmodern literature that I never expected to get into. I very rarely read fiction. I was a few chapters into it. It's very, very thick. But I was very interested in this type of explanation of how the world works. It's a critique of basically our most biological uh, drives and how they're influenced by these dark psychological operations involved by bad actors and almost this conspiratorial end of the world times that are basically motivated by this deep state. And it's such an interesting book because one, it's impossible to keep along just because of how deep it is. I mean, every sentence could be its own book or movie. But one of the things that I love so much about it was because I think it's a perfect description of our times. And I don't think it's any coincidence that One Battle After Another was recently made, because we are seeing this kind of world that is getting so complex, where things are moving so quickly, where things are getting so crazy. It's almost impossible to not talk about how quickly and crazy things are getting. And when you see the character who is motivated by how he believes missiles being launched in the air, or are somehow correlated to his sexual drive in the book, you start finding out that almost this great um, it's almost this great critique of how our most biological urges are somewhat driven by outside forces beyond our control, and they're socially driven. Now, there may not be any cause or correlation. If you go and talk to a psychologist about any statistical correlation does not imply causation, they'll tell you. I don't think that's true, but in some cases it is true. So you have this weird world where it is and isn't true, where this character is finding himself having these sexual urges that are influenced by missiles in the air. It's just such a great critique on the world that we live in today. If you look around and you find out that there is like this cabal that may or may not exist, and it kind of protects itself, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and you see how it works and you see what drives it. I mean, how can you not be interested in this stuff? But one of the reasons I don't go too far into the rabbit hole, actually, I'll tell you how I found out about Gravity's Rainbow. I used to listen to Terence McKenna. Now, the problem with Terence McKenna is that he's really interesting, but he's not taken seriously in any social circles or any academic circles, even though he's probably one of the most well-read men I have ever seen when I listen to his lectures. This guy was obsessed with like DMT and mushrooms, which I think is just, ludicrous. You shouldn't do that, just because I don't think it really worked out for him. But he had a lot of these just off the wall explanations of the world. And he was the one who was very interested in Gravity's Rainbow and said it will completely change your way of thinking. And I think it was Terence McKenna who said that with the creations of artificial intelligence and computers, we were about to see this type of rapid technological growth that was going to lead to this type of social craziness we weren't going to be able to handle. And the problem, though, with Terence McKenna, and I think that this is actually a biblical problem, is that I think he's gone too deep into the rabbit hole. I think that's one of the problems of postmodern literature in general. And I think that actually the Apostle Paul has a good critique for the people that go too far down the rabbit hole. And that is, I can't remember which book of the Bible, but the Apostle Paul says something along the lines of, if you are in search of endless genealogies, it becomes nothing more than quote unquote vain jangling. And so this idea is that if you go after looking for knowledge that's connected in these mysterious ways that may or may not be true, it's actually more harmful than good. And the reason it's more harmful than good is that it actually takes you away from what are essentially first principles. And I can't think of anything better as a critique to this kind of postmodernism where things are true and half untrue, and you'll never know which it is. I think it's just a very good rabbit hole that you should just avoid. And that's one of my things on Thomas Pynchon. I think that he's got all these interesting points and all these interesting stories, and you can get really obsessed with it and make it part of your personality. I see all these like Gen Z guys on YouTube going in saying, "Oh, Thomas Pynchon, he's so interesting," but like I don't think he's someone you want to just get too involved in. You can enjoy his books, you can enjoy his point of view, but I wouldn't take it too seriously because I think it's just a distraction. And I don't think it goes anyplace by the very definition of how it's written. And that's the problem with postmodern literature is that, I believe education is the means to an end. I think it's to make us better. I think it leads us to first principles in search of the truth. And if we constantly sit around saying, I don't know what truth is, you just end up complicating your life more than you should. So that's the reason I'm not a big fan of Thomas Pynchon. And I've I've looked into it. I went down the rabbit hole, but I'll tell you, I came out and there's nothing there that I think is of substance. And I'm sure I'll take a lot of heat for that, but I think it's true. Okay.